When the rain began falling that afternoon, Neil called out all hands that had the strength to come up on deck to catch and store as much water as they could. Because the winds were gusting by then to over 40 knots, and the double reef mainsail couldn't be used as normally could to channel rainwater into buckets, Neil had his crew use a small jib and 2 nylon bimmy covers instead. They caught as much as they could in these, then channelled the water into buckets, and at last into the main storage tanks and their large plastic containers. With the winds making their nylon collectors difficult to control and his crew never having tried this manoeuvre before, there was much swearing and quite a bit of spilled rainwater. However, Neil had also stopped up the drainage holes in the cockpit so the water could be scooped up later. By afternoon they had gathered almost 15 gallons, more than half of it quite clear, and even the water that was rescued from the cockpits was potable. Because they were at last headed back towards land and many were seasick, Tony and Elaine and a few others complained it was all an unnecessary game. But Neil kept them at it for 2 hours. By dusk there was quite a few grumblers. For Jean the day seemed endless. The smell of vomit permeated her cabin, and though the horrifying blast of the sea against her cabin wall had ended, vagabonds still seemed to be thrown around like a tiny dinghy. Elaine, although thoroughly frightened most of the morning, had been reassured by a solicitous Tony for over an hour in the early afternoon and emerged from their tete-a-tete quite cheerful and as oblivious of the rolling and plunging of Vagabond as a globe-circling sailor. Her daughter Rhoda was sick, but nothing seemed to disturb the bland Elaine, who, unable to concentrate on anything for more than a minute or two, was another source of misery for Jean. A delicate wide-eyed blonde, Elaine let her child take up most of her time and was helpless at any job assigned to her. Jean had become so exasperated with her that she was sent to help in the galley that she and Lisa had decided to ask her to stay topside. Jean had offered Elaine and Rhoda the use of a berth and usually slept on the floor herself, but at night Elaine sometimes would wake her up to ask her to get Rhoda a cup of water since Jean was already up, namely on the floor. The child was cranky and slept poorly. Her toys and Elaine's clothes and toiletries could never be confined to the cubicles Jean asked her to use, but ended up sprayed all around the cabin as if by a particularly violent explosion. Elaine was off somewhere with Tony now, and while Skippy, somewhat recovered from his seasickness, played on the cabin floor a few feet away, Jean lay on her back staring at the ceiling and wishing she could express her fears to Neil and be reassured and comforted. She hated feeling so helpless, hated being unable to focus her thoughts on the war, or on her feelings for Neil, or on anything except the dizzying, nauseating motion of the ship. Frank came down 3 or 4 times to comfort her and see if there was anything he could do, but when he tried to clean up some of the vomit, he himself became sick again and had to hasten topside. Neil appeared only twice, once to ask her opinion on their course, an opinion she was reluctant to give, since her mind felt like mashed potatoes still being beaten in the blender, and a second time in the afternoon. He suggested she try to come up and assist with the rain catching. That time she had struggled out of a berth, stood weakly for about 30 seconds, and then fallen woozily into his arms. He had to pick her up and lift her back into her berth. "I hope you're not blaming the captain for this," he said. "I'm beyond blaming," she replied wearily, realising sadly that she wished he would go away so he wouldn't see her looking like a drowned cat and smelling worse. "You'll be over it by tomorrow," he suggested. "Get some sleep." "I'll never be over it," she moaned. "I'll remember this moment as long as I live." "Since it's so special, I plan to try to see to it that you live a very long time," Neil said. She looked over at him, tried to smile, and feebly squeezed his hand. "I'm sorry I'm letting you down," she said. "Never," he said. "I just hoped the fresh air might help." Neil released her hand and wiped the perspiration from her face with the edge of the sheet. Frank came twice more, but she didn't see Neil again until the next day. The final indignity for Jean came that evening as the storm seemed to be getting even worse. Elaine came cheerfully down into the cabin and told her that Jean could sleep in Elaine's berth that night with little Rhoda. Elaine was going to be with Tony. So Jean, miserable, was left to babysit while Elaine spent the night being comforted by Tony. She was too sick to be angry. She had barely had the strength to wonder where the two lovers had had the chance to become lovers in the crowded boat. Some day she'd ask. They picked up the light at Cape Lookout on the North Carolina coast at midnight. By 2:30 a.m. they had left it on their starboard beam while making for the Moorhead City inlet. The storm, Neil had concluded, must be coming directly at them. The winds, instead of becoming more northerly as he'd expected, as if the storm were passing out to sea, was in fact becoming more southerly. The storm centre must be moving right up the coastline. In any case, the winds were still blowing at about 45 knots with stronger gusts, and the seas remained between 8 and 10 feet. To turn south now would be impossible. Fortunately, the Moorhead City inlet was deep, wide and well marked. Immediate protection was available as soon as they got inside and made it for the turning basin. Neil had entered the channel on half a dozen occasions. Although he hated approaching land in storm conditions, he was not particularly worried under the circumstances, not with a boat and a crew he had confidence in. As he neared the inlet, it was Frank and Tony's watch. Lisa and Jim, who had just come off duty, remained on deck more out of excitement than necessity. Still sailing under the storm jib and double reef main, they had already picked up the white flashing sea buoy that marked the beginning of the big ship channel when Neil turned on the transistor radio. He wanted to try again to pick up local news about conditions in the Moorhead City area. The best he could do was a station from Charleston, South Carolina. The voice announced that they were going to repeat the President's address to the nation that had been broadcast at 11 o'clock that evening, 4 hours before. With Frank handling the helm and the radio placed on the shelf to his left, the other three men and Lisa lined up along the front of the wheelhouse, peering through the plexiglass windows with their half-dozen bullet holes out into the darkness and listening to the President's voice. "Good evening, my fellow Americans," the voice began, slow, sombre and sincere. "It is my sad duty to speak to you on this 5th day of this horrible conflict. Our nation, a victim of unprovoked attack by the Soviet Union, has suffered immense devastation. So many of our cities have been destroyed that, as you know, our ability to communicate with each other has been considerably reduced. The ability of your government to deal with the chaos and suffering which has overtaken many parts of our land is extremely limited. It is the task of our military forces to continue to wage war on the Soviet Union, not only to avenge the horror they have inflicted upon us, but also in order to try to destroy their nation before the freedom of all peoples has vanished from the earth. Those of us who have survived the initial Soviet onslaught must always keep in our hearts that we are fighting on now, both for our individual survival and the survival of the very idea of freedom. Mankind is at a terrifying crossroads, whether we shall all fall under the yoke of communist dictatorship or live on with our cherished principles of individualism and freedom intact. I urge you all to do everything in your power to contribute to the struggle. I have unleashed the full power of our military forces against the Soviet Union, and I am happy to report to you this morning that although more than half of our great nation lies in ruins, even more of the Soviet Union has been destroyed. We have received no further reports of effective enemy action in the last 24 hours. The Russian people are also suffering for the crimes committed by their masters. However, despite our enormous successes, I'm afraid that this morning I must issue a momentous warning that will take the form of an executive order. I have been advised by our best scientists working with the National Security Council that all Americans still living in certain areas of the northeastern part of our country must evacuate immediately. I'm speaking now to the people of eastern Ohio, New York, Massachusetts, Connecticut, Rhode Island, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Maryland and Delaware. Within 10 days to 2 weeks, the radioactive fallout from the war will have accumulated to such a degree that its effects will make life in these areas almost impossible. Residents are to move as quickly as possible either to Canada or areas in the far north of the region, or south at least as far as North Carolina. The United States military forces will provide all assistance at their disposal, but airplanes and vehicles are in extremely short supply. In most cases, you will have to provide for your own transportation. Do not be deceived if your area has not received significant radioactive fallout. All indications are that radioactivity and its effects will spread and become worse, causing not only the death to humans immediately, but contaminating water and food supplies, which will make these areas uninhabitable in the future. I hereby direct all citizens. The President's voice went firmly on, reporting next on the greatly reduced level of fighting in Europe caused by the high casualties sustained on each side, and indicating that he considered the stalemate to be a victory for the forces of freedom, although the destruction in most of Europe was, of course, a great historical tragedy. He also indicated that he had sent a stern note to the governments of all 13 nations of South America. He threatened grave consequences if they continued to profess strict neutrality in the world conflict. Although most of these governments were fascist dictatorships, they were still historically part of the free peoples of the American continent, and their refusal to permit United States military forces to use certain ports, air bases and fuel depots for repairs and resupply was hampering the war effort. In particular, the decision of Venezuela and Trinidad and Tobago to stop selling oil to the US was tantamount to an act of war and would not be tolerated. He also condemned the governments of Mexico, the Bahamas, and several unnamed South American countries for their unjust, short-sighted and sometimes cruel treatment of American refugees. He concluded his address with an announcement that Congress, unable to meet, he was using powers granted to him as Commander-in-Chief under martial law to order all Americans between the ages of 18 and 45 to report immediately for military services. His last words were an appeal to his fellow Americans to stand tall in this great crisis. When the President finished speaking and a commentator began summarising his address, Neil turned off the radio. Jim and Tony went and sat down on the settee while Frank remained at the wheel. Neil sat down opposite them. They all became aware again of the sound of the wind and a vagabond rushing down the seas in the darkness. "It all seems so impossible," Frank finally said, still staring forward. "The President talks about the depopulation of the whole northeast as if they were evacuating a small town because of a gas leak." "I wonder why the big cities got hit so bad," Tony mused. "I thought I read somewhere that Arizona and North Dakota were the places that were going to get clobbered, our missile sites." No one answered. "I wonder what standing tall means," Tony went on in a low voice. "It means we're all drafted," Neil commented. "Except for Frank," Tony commented. "I may not be drafted," Frank said from the wheel, "but there'll be things for me to do, too. Our country needs us all now." Again no one spoke. Vagabonds surged and roller coasted forward in the darkness, rolled and surged again. The three men behind Frank sat silently staring at the deck between them, swaying with the ship's swoops and sweeps. Neil stood up for a moment to look forward and then sat back down.